There are moments when a person does not fall apart loudly, but quietly, like something inside them simply stops holding on. Olivia Hayes had been living in that silence for weeks, maybe longer than she was willing to admit even to herself. The small diner on the edge of downtown Chicago had become the place where she learned how to function without feeling present, where every shift blurred into the next and every smile she gave customers felt like it belonged to someone else. At 26 years old, white skin, tired eyes that no longer carried any real expectation of change, she moved through her job like it was a habit rather than a choice. Wake up, work, go home, repeat. That was all it had become. There was a time when she believed things could be different, but that version of her felt distant now, like someone she had known briefly and then lost contact with. Lately, even small things felt heavy, like answering simple questions or pretending to care about conversations she no longer had the energy to follow. She had started thinking, without saying it out loud, that maybe she was reaching the point where continuing did not feel necessary anymore, just automatic. That afternoon, the diner was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made the sound of plates and footsteps feel louder than they actually were. Olivia stood behind the counter, wiping the same surface twice without noticing she had already cleaned it, her movements slow, unfocused, almost mechanical. Outside the large window, Chicago traffic moved steadily, people walking with purpose, cars stopping and going, life continuing in a direction she no longer felt connected to. She looked at them without really seeing them, as if they belonged to a different version of reality that she had slowly stepped out of without realizing it. The bell above the diner door rang softly, breaking the rhythm of her thoughts. She did not look up immediately, expecting another ordinary customer, another face she would forget within minutes. But when she finally did, she noticed him. Ethan Moretti entered without urgency, without noise, but the atmosphere seemed to adjust the moment he stepped inside. He did not look around like most people did. His attention went directly to her, steady, controlled, unreadable. Olivia straightened slightly out of instinct, putting on the version of herself that worked in customer service, polite, distant, automatic. She greeted him, and he responded with a small nod before choosing a seat near the window instead of the counter. She prepared coffee without being asked, as she did for most regulars or quiet customers, placing it in front of him without expecting conversation. For a moment, she thought that would be the extent of their interaction, just another silent exchange that would end and be forgotten. But Ethan did not look away. He stayed seated, observing her not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt intentional, as if he had noticed something she had not yet said out loud. After a few moments he spoke, his voice calm, measured, asking a simple question that did not match the usual rhythm of the diner. "What are you running from?" The question did not feel loud, but it landed heavily, like something that had been waiting to be asked for a long time. Olivia paused, her hand still resting on the counter, her first instinct to dismiss it, to treat it like an unnecessary intrusion from a stranger. But something about the way he looked at her made it difficult to immediately turn the moment into nothing. She gave a small, controlled smile and said she was not running from anything, just working, just living like everyone else. Her voice sounded practiced even to her. Ethan did not respond right away. He simply continued to look at her, as if her answer had only confirmed something he already suspected. Outside, the world kept moving without pause, but inside the diner, something subtle had shifted. Olivia returned to her tasks, but her movements were slower now, slightly less automatic, as if the question had stayed behind in the space she was trying to move through. For the first time that day, she felt the weight of being noticed in a way she could not easily ignore. Olivia Hayes noticed that the question lingered longer than it should have, not because it demanded an answer, but because it seemed to remain in the air even after she had chosen not to respond fully. The diner continued its slow afternoon rhythm, the sound of a coffee machine steaming in the background, plates being stacked, chairs shifting against tile floors, yet something about the space felt slightly altered, as if her earlier exchange with Ethan Moretti had created a thin layer of awareness she could not easily step out of. She moved behind the counter with the same practiced motion she always used during shifts, refilling napkin holders, wiping surfaces that were already clean, checking items she had already checked, but her focus kept slipping back to the man sitting near the window. Ethan had not changed his posture since arriving. He was not distracted by his phone or the environment around him. Instead, he remained still, observing in a way that felt less like evaluation and more like recognition, as if he had seen something in her that she had not yet fully acknowledged herself. Olivia tried to dismiss it as just another unusual customer interaction, but the feeling of being seen in that specific way did not fade easily. When she brought another cup of water to a nearby table, she became aware that her movements felt slightly slower than usual, as if her attention was divided between her tasks and the silent weight of his presence. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again, his voice calm and even, asking her if she always answered questions about her life so quickly, or if she simply preferred not to think about them. Olivia paused briefly, her hand resting on the edge of a tray, and gave a small, careful response that most people did not ask her personal questions during work, and that there was usually no reason to turn simple conversations into something deeper. Her answer was polite, controlled, and familiar even to her own ears, but it did not seem to affect him in the way she expected. Ethan continued to watch her quietly, his expression unchanged, as if he was listening to something beyond the words themselves. Outside, Chicago remained in motion, cars passing through intersections, pedestrians moving under cold air, the city continuing its indifferent rhythm. Inside the diner, however, the space between them felt increasingly defined, not through sound but through attention. Olivia returned to the counter and attempted once again to focus on closing small tasks, but her mind kept circling back to the earlier question he had asked, the one she had dismissed too quickly to fully process. It was not the question itself that unsettled her, but the fact that it had been asked without judgment, without expectation, as if the answer mattered more than the performance of normal conversation. Ethan eventually stood from his seat, not abruptly but with controlled ease, and walked toward the counter where she was working. Olivia slowed her movements as he approached, unsure of what he intended, but he did not ask for anything related to service. Instead, he stopped at a respectful distance and looked at her directly, repeating the earlier question in a slightly different form, asking what would change if she stopped pretending she was fine. The question created a pause that felt heavier than the others, and for a moment Olivia did not respond at all, her attention fixed on the counter as if searching for something that could interrupt the weight of what he had just said. After a long silence, she admitted quietly that she did not really know what would change, because she had been functioning the same way for so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to stop pretending. Ethan did not react immediately. He simply remained still, his presence steady and unchanged, as if her answer had confirmed something he already understood rather than revealed something new. The diner continued its slow afternoon rhythm around them, but the space between Olivia and Ethan felt increasingly separate from everything else, as if their conversation had begun forming its own quiet boundary inside the ordinary world. Olivia Hayes began to realize that the silence inside the diner was no longer simply part of the environment, but something that felt shaped by the presence of Ethan Moretti, as if every pause between sounds carried a slightly different weight than before. The afternoon light had shifted further toward evening, stretching across the windows in long fading angles that made the interior feel warmer but also more enclosed, as though the outside world was gradually becoming less connected to what was happening inside. Olivia continued moving through her tasks, but her focus was increasingly fragmented, splitting between routine actions and the awareness that Ethan had not once broken his attention away from her since their conversation began. He remained seated near the window, posture steady, hands relaxed, his expression calm but not distant, as if he was observing her without the intention of interrupting her work, yet unable to stop noticing the way she carried herself through it. Olivia tried to return to her usual rhythm, stacking plates and wiping counters that no longer needed cleaning, but her thoughts kept circling back to the idea that he had asked questions no one else ever bothered to ask her, and worse, that she had answered them more honestly than she intended. When she brought an order to another table, she became aware of how her movements felt slightly less automatic than earlier in the day, as if she was now partially conscious of being observed while performing them. Ethan finally stood again after a long stretch of silence, walking toward the counter with the same controlled pace that defined everything he did, stopping at a point that was neither too close nor distant, but intentionally measured. Olivia slowed her work as he approached, sensing that the moment carried a different kind of weight, not from urgency, but from something that felt more final in its direction. He did not ask another casual question this time. Instead, he looked at her directly and asked what she thought would happen if she allowed herself to stop pretending that everything in her life was acceptable the way it was. The question was simple in form but heavy in implication, and Olivia felt a brief hesitation that extended longer than any of her previous responses. She looked down at the counter, then toward the side, as if searching for a version of her answer that would not require her to confront something she had avoided for a long time. After a moment, she admitted quietly that she was not sure anything would happen at all because she had stopped expecting change so long ago that even imagining it felt unfamiliar. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged but attentive, as if her uncertainty itself was more revealing than any clear answer could have been. The diner around them continued its normal rhythm, the sound of distant conversations, the clink of dishes, the steady hum of routine, but the space between them felt increasingly distinct from everything else, as if their exchange had created a quiet boundary within the ordinary world. Olivia returned to her work after speaking, but her movements were slower now, more conscious, and less tied to habit alone. Ethan returned to his seat by the window, but the distance between them no longer felt like separation in the usual sense, instead becoming something that felt like a pause in an ongoing awareness that neither of them had chosen to define. After several minutes, he spoke again without turning fully toward her, asking if she had ever considered that accepting things as they were might be more exhausting than trying to change them. Olivia stopped briefly in her movements, her hands resting still on the counter, and for the first time she did not immediately dismiss the question or redirect her attention elsewhere. The silence that followed did not feel empty, but rather full of something she could not yet name, and Ethan did not press for an answer, allowing the moment to remain open. Olivia resumed her work, but her awareness of him remained steady, and she began to recognize that the discomfort she felt was no longer coming from being observed, but from the possibility that she might be understood in a way she had not allowed herself to imagine. Fiona Hayes had started to notice that the presence of Ethan Moretti in the diner was no longer experienced as a single moment or interaction, but as a continuous awareness that stayed with her even when she was not directly looking at him. The evening shift had fully settled in now, with warmer artificial lighting replacing the last traces of daylight, casting soft reflections across polished tables and half-empty cups that had been left behind by customers who were slowly leaving one by one. The sound of the diner had changed into a quieter rhythm, plates being collected, chairs sliding gently across the floor, the distant hum of conversation fading into isolated words. Fiona moved through her closing tasks with practiced efficiency, but there was a noticeable shift in her attention, as if part of her awareness was no longer fully anchored in routine. Ethan remained seated near the window, his posture unchanged, his gaze occasionally shifting toward her without interruption or distraction, as if the passage of time did not alter the consistency of his focus. Fiona found herself more conscious of small details now, the way she set down objects, the way she turned her head when responding to customers, the way her movements felt slightly less mechanical than earlier in the day, as if something subtle had been awakened in the way she experienced being present in her own environment. When she passed by his table, she noticed he no longer appeared to be simply observing, but instead seemed to be waiting for a moment that had not yet fully arrived, as if the conversation between them had not reached its final shape. After a longer silence than before, Ethan stood again and walked toward the counter, not with urgency but with the same steady control that defined all of his movements throughout the day, stopping at a position that allowed space but did not create distance. Fiona slowed her actions as he approached, sensing that this moment was not another question in a series, but something closer to a turning point in the way their interaction was forming. He did not begin with a question this time. Instead, he looked at her for a brief moment and said that exhaustion often disguised itself as acceptance, and that people sometimes stopped noticing how tired they were of their own lives because they had become used to carrying them. The statement was not delivered with force, but it carried a weight that made Fiona pause in a way she had not experienced earlier in the day. She looked down at the counter, her hands resting still for a moment, as if the words had interrupted a pattern she had not realized she was following. After a brief silence, she admitted that she did not think she had the energy to separate exhaustion from acceptance anymore, because both had begun to feel the same in her daily experience. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady but attentive, as if her words confirmed something he had already begun to understand rather than revealing something entirely new. Outside, the evening had fully taken over the city, with headlights reflecting across wet pavement and distant movement continuing beyond the diner windows, while inside the atmosphere felt increasingly contained, as if their conversation had created a subtle boundary that separated them from everything outside. Fiona returned to her tasks after speaking, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate and less automatic, as if she was beginning to notice the difference between performing work and simply repeating it. Ethan returned to his seat near the window, but the distance between them no longer felt fixed in the same way it had earlier in the day, instead becoming something more fluid, as if it could shift depending on what was said next or left unsaid. After several minutes, he spoke again without turning fully toward her, asking if she had ever considered that the point where someone feels like giving up is often the exact moment where they have stopped hearing themselves clearly rather than stopped caring entirely. Fiona paused at the counter, her hands still, her attention caught not by the complexity of the question but by the unexpected clarity it seemed to offer. The silence that followed was no longer empty or uncertain, but something that felt structured, as if it was holding space for a thought she had not yet fully formed. Ethan did not press for a response, allowing the moment to remain open, and Fiona resumed her work with a changed sense of awareness, recognizing that something within her understanding of her own exhaustion had already begun to shift in ways she could not yet fully define. Fiona Hayes had begun to feel that the presence of Ethan Moretti was no longer just an external factor inside the diner, but something that subtly influenced the way she experienced even the most ordinary parts of her shift, as if her awareness of time and routine had become slightly altered by the consistency of his attention. The evening had deepened further, with the diner now entering its quieter phase where only a few customers remained, their presence scattered and unhurried, the sound of utensils and soft conversation blending into a calm background rhythm. Fiona moved behind the counter with controlled efficiency, continuing her closing tasks, yet her movements no longer felt entirely automatic, because part of her attention remained anchored in the steady presence near the window. Ethan had not changed his position in any noticeable way, but his attention toward her felt increasingly direct in a way that was difficult to ignore, not because it demanded anything, but because it remained consistent without distraction. Fiona found herself noticing small details she would normally overlook, the way she set down objects more carefully, the way she adjusted her posture when she became aware of being observed, the way silence between actions no longer felt entirely empty. When she passed his table again, she noticed that he was no longer simply watching her work, but instead seemed to be following the rhythm of her movements as if trying to understand something unspoken within them. After a longer stretch of quiet, Ethan stood and walked toward the counter once more, not breaking the calm atmosphere but shifting it slightly through presence alone, stopping at a distance that felt intentionally respectful but undeniably focused. Fiona slowed her actions as he approached, sensing that this moment carried a different quality than earlier exchanges, not because it was louder or more direct, but because it felt more grounded in something that had been building quietly throughout the day. He did not begin with another question immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a moment and said that people often mistake silence for stability, when in reality silence can also be a form of exhaustion that has not yet been recognized as such. The statement created a pause that felt heavier than the previous conversations, and Fiona found herself momentarily still, her hands resting on the counter as she considered the weight of what had just been said. After a brief silence, she admitted that she had become so accustomed to quiet endurance that she no longer thought of it as something that could be questioned, only something that continued because stopping it felt unfamiliar. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression remaining steady but attentive, as if her words were not conclusions but indicators of something still unfolding beneath them. Outside, the city had fully transitioned into night, with headlights passing across wet streets and distant movement continuing beyond the diner windows, while inside the atmosphere felt increasingly contained, as if their conversation had created its own quiet boundary within the ordinary world. Fiona returned to her tasks after speaking, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate, and less tied to habit alone, as if she was beginning to notice the difference between existing within routine and becoming aware of it. Ethan returned to his seat near the window, but the distance between them no longer felt fixed in the same way it had earlier in the day, instead becoming something that shifted slightly with each exchange, as if the space itself was responding to their conversation. After several minutes, he spoke again without turning fully toward her, asking if she had ever considered that the moment someone feels like they are reaching their limit is often the moment they have simply stopped being heard by themselves rather than by others. Fiona paused in her work, her attention caught not by the complexity of the question but by the unsettling familiarity of the feeling it described. The silence that followed did not feel empty, but instead felt like a pause that held something unfinished within it, and Ethan did not attempt to close it with further words. Fiona resumed her work, but her awareness of him remained steady, and she began to recognize that what had started as a series of questions was now forming into something deeper, something that was slowly shifting the way she understood her own exhaustion. Not as an ending, but as something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Fiona Hayes had reached a point in her shift where the diner no longer felt like a place defined by tasks or customers, but instead felt like a quiet container for everything that had been said between her and Ethan Moretti throughout the day, as if each question had left behind a trace that continued to shape how she moved through the space. The night had fully settled outside, with Chicago streets glowing under steady lines of headlights and reflections on wet pavement, while inside the diner the lighting felt warmer but more subdued, giving the remaining hours a slower and more reflective tone. Only a few customers remained now, seated at separate tables, their presence no longer disruptive but distant, allowing the atmosphere between Fiona and Ethan to become more noticeable without interruption. Fiona continued her closing routine behind the counter, but her actions had shifted subtly in rhythm, less mechanical than before, as if she was no longer performing tasks solely out of habit but also with a faint awareness of how she occupied space within them. Ethan remained seated near the window, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer drifted outward toward the city. Instead, it stayed consistently on her, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested sustained understanding rather than casual observation. Fiona found herself noticing that she no longer reacted to his presence with immediate dismissal or distraction, but instead with a kind of quiet recognition that had developed gradually throughout the evening. When she passed his table again, she realized that the silence between them no longer felt empty or uncertain, but structured, as if it had become part of the conversation itself. After a longer pause than before, Ethan stood and walked toward the counter again, not breaking the calm environment but shifting it slightly through presence alone, stopping at a position that allowed space without removing attention. Fiona slowed her movements instinctively, sensing that this moment was different not because it introduced something new, but because it gathered everything that had already been said into a quieter, more concentrated point. He did not begin with another question immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a brief moment and said that exhaustion often becomes invisible not because it disappears, but because people become skilled at functioning inside it without acknowledging its presence anymore. The statement landed with a stillness that felt deeper than earlier exchanges, and Fiona found herself pausing entirely for a moment, her hands resting on the counter as she processed the weight of what he had said. After a brief silence, she admitted that she had not thought of exhaustion as something that could accumulate without recognition, only as something temporary that people were expected to manage until it passed. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady but attentive, as if her response confirmed a pattern he had already begun to understand rather than revealing something unexpected. Outside, the city continued its steady movement through the night, with passing cars and distant streetlights creating a constant backdrop beyond the diner windows, while inside the space felt increasingly separate from everything external, as if their conversation had created its own contained reality within the ordinary world. Fiona returned to her work after speaking, but her movements were no longer entirely routine, because each action now carried a subtle awareness that she was no longer simply repeating patterns without reflection. Ethan returned to his seat near the window, but the distance between them no longer felt fixed in the way it had earlier in the day, instead becoming something more fluid that shifted slightly with each exchange of silence and speech. After several minutes, he spoke again without turning fully toward her, asking if she had ever noticed that people often stop questioning their own limits not when they are strong, but when they are too tired to recognize there is still another direction available to them. Fiona paused in her movement, her attention caught not by the complexity of the question but by the familiarity of its implication, as if it described something she had experienced without having words for it. The silence that followed did not feel unresolved or empty, but instead felt like a space holding something that had not yet reached its full expression, and Ethan did not attempt to fill it. Fiona resumed her work slowly, But her awareness of him remained steady, and she began to understand that what had started as a series of quiet questions had gradually become something more significant, not a disruption of her life, but a reflection of it that she could no longer easily ignore. Fiona Hayes had begun to recognize that the silence between her and Ethan Moretti was no longer a lack of sound, but something structured and intentional, as if every pause had become part of a conversation that extended beyond spoken words and into the way she now perceived her own thoughts during the final hours of her shift. The diner was nearly empty at this point, with only the faint sound of cleaning routines beginning in the background, chairs being turned over on tables, and the soft hum of machines preparing for closure, while outside the night had fully taken over Chicago, turning the streets into long reflections of light and movement against wet pavement. Fiona moved with slower and more reflective actions than earlier in the evening, her attention divided between closing tasks and an awareness that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. The awareness of being seen in a way that did not reduce her to function or routine. Ethan remained near the window, his posture unchanged, yet his presence no longer felt like something separate from the environment, but rather something that had become integrated into the rhythm of the space itself. Fiona noticed that she no longer experienced his silence as absence, but as continuity, as if the unspoken space between them had become just as meaningful as the questions he had asked throughout the day. When she passed his table again, she felt the weight of his attention not as pressure, but as consistency, something steady that did not fluctuate with distraction or impatience. After a long pause, Ethan stood again and approached the counter with the same controlled calm that had defined every movement he made since entering the diner, stopping at a position that allowed space while maintaining presence. Fiona slowed her actions instinctively as he arrived, sensing that this moment was not another addition to their conversation, but something that gathered everything previously spoken into a quieter point of understanding. He did not ask a question immediately. Instead, he looked at her briefly and said that people often confuse endurance with strength, when in reality endurance sometimes becomes the result of having no longer considered other options. The statement lingered in the air longer than expected, and Fiona found herself pausing completely, her hands resting on the counter as she absorbed the meaning behind it. After a brief silence, she admitted that she had never thought of her persistence as something separate from survival, because for a long time the two had become indistinguishable in her daily life. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady but attentive, as if her response confirmed a pattern rather than introduced new information. Outside, the city continued its night rhythm, headlights passing in steady intervals, distant traffic blending into a constant background presence, while inside the diner the atmosphere felt increasingly self-contained, as if their exchange had created a subtle boundary between their conversation and everything beyond it. Fiona returned to her closing tasks after speaking, but her movements were no longer fully automatic, because each action now carried a faint awareness that she was not simply performing routine, but moving within a space that had become altered by perception. Ethan returned to his seat near the window, yet the distance between them no longer felt like separation in the way it had earlier in the day, instead feeling like a quiet interval within a continuous exchange that neither of them had defined but both were now sustaining. After several minutes, he spoke again without turning fully toward her, asking if she had ever realized that sometimes people do not lose hope suddenly, but instead gradually stop noticing when it leaves them. Fiona paused at the counter, her attention caught not by the complexity of the statement but by the recognition it created within her, as if it named something she had experienced without language. The silence that followed was no longer empty or unresolved, but felt like a space holding something in formation, and Ethan made no attempt to close it or guide it further. Fiona resumed her work slowly, but her awareness of him remained steady, and she began to understand that what had started as a series of quiet questions had become something more persistent, not an interruption of her life, but a reflection of it that she could no longer easily separate from her own thoughts. Olivia Hayes had reached the final stretch of her shift without realizing how much had changed in the way she experienced even the smallest moments inside the diner, as if the space she had worked in for so long no longer belonged only to routine, but had slowly become a place where something internal was being reflected back at her through the presence of Ethan Moretti. The night outside had deepened further, with Chicago now fully wrapped in darkness, streetlights stretching across wet pavement in long reflections that moved whenever cars passed, while inside the diner the remaining glow felt softer and quieter, signaling the slow approach of closing time. Most customers had already left, leaving only a few scattered tables still occupied, their conversations low and unimportant compared to the silence that had begun to settle more heavily between Olivia and Ethan throughout the evening. Olivia moved behind the counter with slower motions than earlier in the day, her tasks nearly finished, yet her awareness of everything around her felt sharper, as if she was noticing details she would normally have filtered out without thought. Ethan remained near the window for a long time without speaking, his posture unchanged, but his attention felt more present than before, not as observation alone, but as something that seemed to recognize a state within her she had not admitted openly. Olivia had begun to feel that the weight of the day was no longer just exhaustion from work, but something deeper that had been slowly accumulating beneath it, something that no longer felt manageable through routine alone. When she finally stepped away from the counter to clear the last occupied table, she felt a brief heaviness in her movements, as if each action required more intention than it should have. Ethan stood shortly after and walked toward the counter again, but this time he did not begin with a question or statement. He simply waited until she finished what she was doing, and when she looked up, she saw that his expression had not changed, but something in his presence felt more grounded, as if the conversation had reached a point where it no longer needed to move in circles. Olivia stopped her work entirely for a moment, sensing that what was coming would not be another question she could easily deflect. After a brief silence, she spoke first without being prompted, her voice quieter than before, admitting that she felt like she had been holding on for too long to a life that no longer felt like hers, but did not know how to step out of it without losing the only structure she still had. The words came out slowly, as if they had been waiting beneath her thoughts for a long time before finally being allowed to surface. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention steady and focused, and for the first time throughout the evening, there was no follow-up question immediately after her admission. The silence that followed felt heavier than any previous pause, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it felt like it was holding something at the edge of change. Olivia looked down at the counter, her hands resting still, and for a brief moment she felt the full weight of everything she had not said to anyone for a very long time. Then Ethan spoke, his voice calm and direct, not louder than before but carrying a clarity that cut through the stillness in a way that felt final in its simplicity. He said 4 words that did not feel like instruction, but like recognition, telling her that she was not done. The words settled into the space between them without urgency, but with a presence that made Olivia stop completely, her breath slowing as she processed what had just been said. It was not encouragement in the usual sense, nor was it reassurance that ignored reality, but something that felt like a refusal to accept the version of herself she had already decided was finished. For the first time that night, Olivia did not immediately return to her routine or dismiss what she had heard, because something in those words disrupted the certainty she had been carrying about her own limits. Ethan did not add anything further. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly, allowing the silence to remain without forcing it into resolution. Olivia remained behind the counter, her movements still paused, and in that stillness she began to recognize that something she had assumed was ending might not actually be at its conclusion, but instead at a point where it had only just begun to shift. Olivia Hayes remained still behind the counter for a moment longer than she intended, as the weight of Ethan Moretti's final words continued to settle into the silence of the nearly empty diner, not as a command or reassurance, but as something that disrupted the way she had been defining herself for a very long time. The night outside had fully taken over Chicago, the streets now glowing under steady streams of passing headlights and reflections on damp pavement, while inside the diner the remaining light felt soft and subdued, marking the final minutes before closing. Most of the customers had already left, and the space felt quieter than at any point earlier in the evening, as if the entire environment had narrowed down to the distance between the counter and the window where Ethan still stood. Olivia finally moved again, but her actions were slower, less mechanical than before, as if something in her internal rhythm had been interrupted and not yet restored. She began the final steps of closing the diner, but her attention was no longer fully anchored in routine, because her awareness kept returning to the fact that she had just heard something that did not fit into the version of her life she had already accepted as final. Ethan did not speak again immediately. He remained where he was, observing her with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the day, but there was no longer any question in his presence, only a quiet certainty that whatever had been said had already created its effect. Olivia avoided looking directly at him for a few moments, focusing instead on tasks she no longer needed to think about, wiping surfaces, organizing items, checking spaces that were already in order, as if movement alone could stabilize her thoughts. But the words remained with her, repeating quietly in a way that made it difficult to return fully to her previous sense of emotional distance. When she finally did look up again, Ethan had moved slightly closer to the exit, no longer positioned near the window, as if the moment itself was beginning to naturally conclude without needing explanation. Olivia hesitated, then spoke before he could fully leave, her voice softer than before, admitting that she did not know what it meant to not be done, because she had spent so long believing that she had already reached the end of what she could handle. The admission did not feel dramatic, but it felt honest in a way that surprised even her. Ethan stopped near the door and turned slightly back toward her, not with urgency, but with the same controlled presence that had defined every interaction between them. He did not expand on his earlier words, nor did he attempt to reshape her response. Instead, he simply looked at her for a moment longer, as if confirming that she had heard something that could not be unheard. The silence between them was no longer filled with questions, but with a kind of recognition that did not require continuation in order to remain meaningful. Olivia stood behind the counter, no longer moving, and realized that the feeling she had been carrying all day was no longer just exhaustion or routine dissatisfaction, but something closer to the awareness that her perception of limits had been shaped more by habit than by truth. Ethan finally turned toward the exit and stepped out of the diner without another word, the bell above the door ringing softly as he left, blending into the sound of the city outside. For a few seconds after he was gone, Olivia did not move, remaining still in the quiet space he had left behind. The diner was now empty except for her, and the closing process felt suddenly slower, as if time itself had shifted slightly. She looked toward the window where he had stood earlier, then back at the counter, and for the first time that night, the idea that she might not be finished with herself felt less like a distant concept and more like a question she could no longer avoid.